So let's take a look. This is just what I had you do right now. In essence, discipline means to teach. A lot of you mentioned that. My parents taught me this. And that is really the underlying, what we're trying to get across here with discipline, is to teach. It's considered a positive method of teaching self-control and confidence. Helps the child take responsibility for their own behavior, okay, which over time, that is what we want to instill intrinsically. Okay, so even though we're setting the parameters as to what's appropriate, not appropriate, right or wrong, it's over time that we want them to be able to get those ingrained. And a process for teaching children how to get along with others. Okay, punishment, if you look under discipline, punishment can be considered a technique that we use to discipline a child, that we use to teach kind of this behavior from that. However, typically it's a parental tool that's used after a problem surfaces. The focus here is on what is wrong that the child's doing. And really the point is we want them to be able to replace that behavior with something that's appropriate. So the focus really should be on what we want them to do, right? And it is typically seen as a consequence of not following established rules. However, there's other consequences that we can put in place that wouldn't be considered necessarily punishment. Some of you mentioned hitting, slapping. It does have the physical elements. It could. But it could have elements of loss of privileges, which actually can be quite effective with kids. Okay. However, there's parents that do ridicule, degrade the child, shame the child, and that isn't seen as sort of a positive way of disciplining your child. And the thing is, when you look in the literature, you'll see a lot on punishment. There's been a lot done with it, and it's really how it's applied that matters. For the most part, you have a parent who's gotten upset, they're angry, and oftentimes that's sort of driving the whole dynamic here, okay? So what we're talking about is we're going to talk about a way of being able to apply discipline, and in fact you could use punishment as a method, but you need to be real cautious if you're going to as to how you're going to use it. Okay, are you going to use it in a respectful way that you're respecting the child? Okay, and the thing is, if you really want the child to understand that they are in control of their behavior, what happens with punishment, it sort of reverses those roles. Okay, and that's the problem, and that's why oftentimes people say if you can go for other strategies, go for other strategies. Okay, but I'm kind of telling you what's out there, that it is effective. However, we're going to look at some other things that we can do that we might want parents to take advantage of before looking at punishment. Okay, some problems with punishment. Again, putting the responsibility for behavior on the adult. Okay, and depending upon your style of parenting, this could even be more of a problem. If you remember from our training, those that are more authoritarian, who don't care so much what the child thinks or feels about it, they're not going to discuss necessarily the actions themselves and discuss why one's inappropriate versus appropriate. It could even be more problematic if you have that style of parent that's using punishment. Those are the ones that might tend to use it in the extreme, and it could have some negative impact on the child. Doesn't really encourage the child, doesn't teach them what to do instead. So you need to be careful, and we need to remind parents that even though they set up something punitive, what do they want the child to do? And I've seen parents do this even with using timeout. They give them a timeout, but what is it that they're telling them? What is it that they want them to do in replace of the behavior that they're getting the timeout for? Is it clear to the child? And usually it's not. And it really doesn't work in terms of building self-esteem. So goals of a parent typically are to build self-esteem and confidence and accountability and responsibility, all of these things. So that tends to be the problems with applying this. All right, now we're going to segue into learning, okay, and how human beings learn. And actually, this is how all organisms learn, essentially. So we're talking about, animals, the animal kingdom here. And if you've ever had classes in learning, there's typically 3 main bodies of theories behind learning and learning principles. And these 3 theories are still very prominent today. They came about in the early 1900s, but we still use them today for constructing behavior plans, for working with children that have a variety of different problems. We still use these basic principles. We've changed some of the names over time, but essentially it still comes from the same body of work. This has been a constant definition in the field in terms of learning. We're talking about a relatively stable change in behavior. Okay, so we almost want to say that it's permanent. However, if the person perhaps got in an accident later or there was some problem, there may be some loss there and they may have to relearn something. So we use the term relatively stable change in behavior due to experience. Okay, and we want to just emphasize it's not due to necessarily development, like cognitive development or other types of development, maturation. Okay, but there's this change due to experience. Now here, the word behavior, it really, the connotation here is something that is observable, that's measurable. And probably very much for a lot of your notes, and I know definitely for therapists and psychologists, we need to bear this in mind when we talk to people about, particularly about problem behaviors. I need to know, what does it look like? So if they tell me the child feels sad, that they have low self-esteem, they don't have much confidence, I get that, but I need to know what it looks like. So how is it manifesting? So, when you have a parent who's maybe describing this to you and the problems they have with their child, but they're not really getting at, what is the action, what are they doing? Okay, they need to use some verbs there and be able to describe it. And I've had teachers do the same thing. Oh, he's just so lazy, and oftentimes it's totally incorrect, the label for one. But they're really not getting, again, at the behavior. That's what I'm trying to say. You need to use some behavioral words, which, going around the room, I think you guys seem to have that down pretty well. So that's what we're talking about here, because we're going to have to note whether or not there's a change. Okay? It may be that there is a change in mood. The child is feeling better about themselves. They are more confident. Okay? We can infer that, but it has to be inferred based on their behavior. Something different that we're seeing in their behavior. A note about learning, that the capacity to learn is present at birth. It strongly affects development and adaptation throughout the lifespan. Okay? And I want you to keep in mind here that learning, we can learn a lot of really good stuff and ways of coping that are adaptive. We can learn a lot of really bad stuff, ways that aren't adaptive, that don't really necessarily make it better for us or help us cope any better. Okay? And pretty much the method for learning these things is the same. Okay, we're going to talk about some overview of some learning theories. And I'll only spend as much time as I really think that we need to. How many of you have had classes in learning theory? Okay. All right. I do think it's important to revisit these, because when you look at, just in the field today, these are still very prominent, okay? And actually, in some ways, they're more acceptable than some of the other theories because of the fact they're easier to research, really, in some ways. There's a lot of data to support what we're going to be talking about with these theories. However, I just want to let you know, just a precursor, that psychodynamic theory talks about how we learn, talks about unconscious and conscious processes, how our personalities are constructed, and the conflict that arrives in our personalities, and how we learn as a result of that, and how we interface with the world. But that's in a different realm. It's not considered it's considered a learning theory, but it doesn't have the same principles that are applied. So I want you to know there's these other theories out there. There's an ecological theory that has to do more with the environment and the context that the child is in. Okay, so those are ones that you're free to explore and read about. I'm focusing in on learning theories because most typically this is what you guys are going to run across when you talk about behavior plans and working with children. I think sometimes just the ease of being able to explain it even to parents, it lends itself a little bit easier versus psychodynamic theory and some of the others. But I just want you to know that there are other theories that do contribute, okay, to what we know about learning, but this is going to be our focus, okay? So what do we know about classical conditioning? Classical conditioning, the history goes back to about 1920. It's the early 1900s. There was a doctor, a physiologist, who's working in a laboratory with dogs, okay? And actually, he's not studying learning. He's studying digestive processes of the dogs, okay, in a laboratory setting. But what he happens to fall upon, kind of a fluke thing that came out of this, is that he happens to notice that these dogs who automatically respond to a meat powder, basically food, who automatically respond by salivating to this food, are now salivating to the feeders when they hear the feeder walking. Okay? Doesn't sound uncommon. If you have animals at home, you all know this. You open up the cat food can. I have 6 cats at home. It's like I'm attacked by cats, right? But it's the same premise, okay? But the thing is, at this time in history, we really didn't have any real research on this. Didn't have any names for it, okay? So Ivan Pavlov, who's a physiologist, he's studying something totally different. He notices this, okay? Now that he notices that the dogs are salivating when they hear the footsteps. They're not salivating to the meat powder, the food, which is actually a normal physiological reaction, okay? And it's not voluntary, okay? So what they're doing now is voluntary, okay? So the basic premise here is that animals, including us, learn by making associations between events. Okay, and we use the word pairing when we talk about classically conditioned. And the word conditioning is learning. It's the same, it's just a different word we use. But it means learning. But it's a pairing of 2 events, kind of continual pairing. They usually have to be paired typically more than once. Okay? This involves automatic, involuntary responses that are paired with particular stimuli, okay? So these may be some words that you've heard before. If you've had learning classes, you've heard of stimuli. So we're talking about a trigger in the environment, right?